And the recent David Jones case has seen, really for the first time, directors of a publicly listed company being sued for their alleged role in not taking steps to address sexual harassment in the workplace. So what does that mean for being a director? For more, Joydeep joins us from People Plus Culture Strategies, or People and Culture Strategies. He's with me in studio, and great to have you on board, Joydeep. And this is such an interesting case, continues to be. Under current laws, what does it say about whether directors and management are liable for behaviour in the workplace?
Yeah, it's interesting. Under anti-discrimination legislation, which is the legislation that deals with harassment and bullying and discrimination and other things in the workplace, there are provisions that have been in place for a long time that really put the onus on an employer and those in management to make sure that they're taking reasonable steps to prevent any of these kinds of behaviours from occurring. That historically has been limited to the employer as a corporate entity, and I guess in certain limited circumstances those involved in senior management have particular responsibilities as well. I guess what we're seeing with the latest development is that directors are now being scrutinised perhaps in a little bit more detail in terms of their corporate governance role. And I think that the interesting piece in all of this is that a lot of directors would be saying, wow, if part of the deal is that we are now somehow culpable or responsible for those kinds of behaviours, then there's a lot of questions that any prudent director is going to be wanting to ask of senior management before they accept a directorial role.
So it would set kind of precedents in some ways?
Yeah.
I know that's a strong word in legal terms, but does it set precedents?
Yeah, I certainly think it puts into sharper focus what the responsibilities of a director are. Now, it's not dissimilar to the way in which it's operated in, say, occupational health and safety legislation. So around the country, most occupational health and safety laws say that those who are directors, officers of corporations, can be personally sued if their organisation is in breach of their obligations under OHS laws. It's just a little bit unusual to see that now happen in the non-OHS space, but more squarely in the behaviour and culture space, which is what harassment is all about, I guess.
Is there any limit to what directors and management could be liable for? And when you're talking about behaviour, I mean, most of it goes on behind closed doors as well. There's no way you can know, I don't know, there's no way you can be across every single particular employee's behaviour at any given point in time. Absolutely.
I think there's a lot of directors that would be saying, particularly when you're dealing with something such as harassment, a lot of these interactions happen one-on-one, or often they happen in private time. I mean, leave aside whether they do amount to harassment or not,
Sure.
There's not going to be a huge amount of visibility or transparency for those at board level as to what's going on. For example, I don't think too many board meetings would start as agenda item number one with, well, have we had any complaints of discrimination or harassment made against senior executives within the organisation? Perhaps that's something that's going to need to be more closely scrutinised, but a lot of directors, I think, are going to be a little bit nervous about where all of this might be heading.
Is this case specifically, is it going to come with a clear outcome? Obviously they're looking at trying to do deals, and there's this $37 million that they've been talking about, but are we going to get a clear outcome with which we can say, moving forward from here, there's been a line drawn in the sand on this issue?
Look, the vast majority of these kinds of cases do tend to settle. You can never guarantee that there's going to be settlement as an outcome. Usually, if matters do settle, then they're settled on a confidential basis. Sometimes, notwithstanding really tight confidentiality, word gets out as to what the quantum of a settlement might be. There's already been a lot of reporting and speculation as to what the offers have been. But unless it actually goes to court, directors and those involved in management aren't necessarily going to get that line in the sand drawn as to what the scope of their responsibility is. So in some ways, and it's not just me being a lawyer finding that part of it interesting, but I think a lot of directors and a lot of businesses really do need to understand what is the scope of their personal responsibility and liability, and you only get that if it actually does go all the way to court. But usually that's not in too many people's interests.
Yeah, and it's very hard to plead ignorance with these things, I suppose. So what do management, what do directors on boards do now to try and get some of these procedures in place?
I think what really this latest incident or the latest approach in terms of the litigation should be telling directors is that they need to be asking questions of management. What policies, procedures do we have that relate to workplace behaviour? Has everyone in our organisation been appropriately trained in relation to those matters? Do we have the necessary whistleblowing mechanisms and infrastructure so that if someone feels they've been harassed, bullied, whatever else, those things are going to be properly looked into? Are we monitoring whether or not as an organisation we are in fact complying with our obligations? The incidence of these kinds of things should be reduced over time, not being increased. So there's a pretty simple checklist, and I think that part of a board's compliance program really should be some tailored education for them around this whole area of harassment, behaviour and culture.
So all of that is about preventing directors being and management being liable, but again, this isn't to address the actual issues in the workplace, because there's a whole lot another checklist that you'd have to go through for that as well. We've talked before with you about the culture in the organisation, and
that's
doing
right.
a bit of a check on that, an audit of the culture.
Yeah, if you at all can. But I think what we're really talking about here is there's got to be a recognition up to a point that even if you're a very diligent organisation and a very diligent director or a board of directors, you're not going to be able to prevent certain types of behaviours from occurring. Ultimately, people are people and certain things do happen in a workplace context. All an organisation can do is really put themselves in the best possible position to say that, well, we tried our best to prevent certain things from happening. When they did happen, we put in place certain response mechanisms to try to minimise the fallout for everyone that was involved.
Joydeep, good to have you on board. Thank you very much, and a really interesting case. Thank you. Joydeep from People and Culture Strategies. Now, coming up here on Trading Day, we're going to be